Hello and welcome to a Deck Tech. I am SMAW, also known as, well, actually now it is just SMAW on MTGO. I changed account so that it would just be my initials and not my first three initials and my last name. Anyway, this is Duck Tech for a Control Delver that I'm going to be playing in the Pauper Classic Tuesday event tonight, which is the 13th of August. Um, Now, I've been playing this deck for about a month. I've played it in four different uh, tournaments. Three of them have been uh, play-around events, and the other one was a daily event. And overall, I am 11-6 with it, and four of those losses have been to Affinity. A lot of people say that is a 50-50 matchup, but it seems to be most Delver players say it's 60-40, and most Affinity players say it's 60-40 for them. And I don't know what the Delver players are doing that I'm not in that matchup, though I am still learning all the tricks of the deck. But so far, my percentage against Affinity is like 30, like 30%, 70%. Like I've lost to it four times, and I think I beat it once, which actually is not that's 20-80 actually. It's really bad. Like I did bring in, like I have made some changes to my sideboard, which I'll go over in a bit, to try and compensate for that. But let's first of all, this is Control Delver, not Aggro Delver. There now those decks are, I want to say, only 10 cards really differ between the two. Um, but this is more the Sea Weaver Mezzle style, not the X-Mem-X style. Now, starting off with our mana base, is one of the big places where it differs. The more aggro Delver tends to run 16 islands, and that's it. We're going with 17 islands and 2 quicksands. Now, the quicksands I like to think of them as removal spells that act as lands till I don't need the land anymore, or till I desperately need the removal spell. Um, it's just a really solid way to smooth out your mana base while still giving you options. Now, let's go to the namesake of the deck, the Delver of Secrets, who, because he's a flip over card, it's really hard to read in that corner. But well, first of all, Delver of Secrets, we have everyone. If you're playing Pauper, you better know what the Delver of Secrets does. He's one of the format, like Delver of Secrets and Temporal Fissure are probably the two most format warping cards in the entire thing. Um, Delver of Secrets, first of all, blows the 8x5 rule just out of the water. If he flips turn 2, like if you go turn 1 Delver, turn 2 flip, he'll do 12 by turn 5. And he's evasive. Now in this deck, we're running 20 cards that flip him, which means any given turn he has a 33% chance of flipping. So often, like if you look at that as the bad time, and I'm using a lot of, this is technically mathematically fallacious, but if you go on average, he'll flip on turn 2. Well, if you play him turn 1, he'll flip on the second time you reveal a card, so he'll usually flip on turn 3, which means he still does 9 by turn 5. Now, how often that happens is relatively depends on your personal luck. I tend to find he likes to not flip, but when he does flip, he just takes over games. So there are so few creatures that swing as fast and as hard as he does. Um, Next, we have Phantasmal Bear. Now, Phantasmal Bear hits the 8x5 rule. Like a turn 1 Phantasmal Bear can do, if unanswered and unblocked, he'll do 8 by turn 5 just fine. Unfortunately, he's not evasive. And he has that annoying illusion text of when Phantasmal Bear becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. So the decks he's good against, he's really good against. But decks that have Quirion Ranger, or goblins where they have the Mog Raider and the Goblin Sledder, who they can just sack a goblin to kill him if they need to. They'll attack, and whichever goblin you block, they'll just sack to pump another to kill him, and it's just, yeah. And there's a bunch of other creatures that just like I think White Weenie has like Acacian Javelineers, which will just kill it. Uh, Almost like a lot of creature decks have an answer for it, which is kind of odd because it's best against the other control decks where their answer is generally going to be a spell that would have killed it anyways. Like there are very few things in, for instance, Is It Post that kill Phantasmal Bear that weren't going to already just kill Phantasmal Bear. Next in the list, we have Piracy Charm. I would think of Piracy Charm as sort of the blank slate sideboard card. It's never dead, but there's usually a better card in my sideboard against an individual opponent. But against the field, it's better than those sideboard cards. Like, for instance, Piracy Charm is not as good as Steel Sabotage against Affinity, but against Goblins, it's far better than Steel Sabotage, whereas it's going to get subbed out for Hydroblast against Goblins, which isn't very good against Affinity. And that's sort of how I view it. It's the never dead, always does something, but not as good. It's about half as good as the card you would sub it out for. And like against the worst case scenarios, it's that you can just make them discard a card, which usually the best way to do that often is if you get down to where they're top decking, you can just burn it to make them discard it as they draw it. And against a lot of decks, that's sort of gives you an extra turn in a very vague, nebulous sort of way. I'm certainly not going to say it's like a time walk, because it's really not, because you're still down a card over where a time walk would be, and they got to untap and all that other stuff. But it can be very good. Also against like other Delver players, it can occasionally get that Delver in. And I know I personally love to give Phantasmal Bears Island Walk, just because it targets them and kills them, and I have a little giggle because it's kind of pathetic, but I have a little giggle. Anyway, Brainstorm. Now, Brainstorm is probably one of my all-time favorite cards. Like, I loved Brainstorm back in Ice Age when I first started. I was like, awesome art, and I just loved the effect. Now, most of the more aggro-oriented Delver decks tend to run Preordain over Brainstorm, and that's because they have the lower land count, if they keep a one-lander Preordain hand, whereas Brainstorm lets them dig just as deep, if you don't see a land in that, they're much more screwed. On the flip side, because we're running more lands, it's much less likely for us to Brainstorm into first of all, it's much less likely for us to have to keep a one-lander. It still happens, but we're much less likely to flip over the top 3 cards and not see a land, and then be locked into I'm not doing anything till turn 4. Also, unlike Preordain, Brainstorm, if you have another instant in your hand, is a guaranteed Delver flip, whereas Preordain is just a likely Delver flip. Also, it's an instant, so you can, in fact, do it at the end of your opponent's turn, or if you have 3 mana up and you desperately need to try and find a counter, you can Brainstorm and dig and hope to find one. Whereas Preordain, if the Preordain's sitting in your hand and your opponent does something, well, it's going to sit in your hand because it's a sorcery. And I would love to have Ponder in the deck to supplement Brainstorm, but there's just no room. I would also consider dropping 2 islands to go up to put in 2 Terramorphics, just to have the option to have the fetch land with Brainstorm, but it's not worth the tempo hit. As much as I would like to be able to do it, it's not worth it. If we had fetch lands that didn't put the land into play untapped, if Terramorphic was just find a basic land and put it into play, I'd pay 2 life for that. I'd pay more than the good fetch lands. But yeah, moving on. Now we have 2 of the cards that are probably the most unfair cards. Conveniently, they're both from a very unfair set, Urza's Legacy. We have Cloud of Fairy and Snap. Now, Cloud of Fairies and Snap are both really just 2-mana versions of 1-mana cards that are actually free. Like Cloud of Fairies, there's I think it's Zephyr Sprite, 1/1 flying fairy for 1, and Snap is of course unsummon. Now, some players use Vapor Snag instead of Snap because of the 1 life loss, but I find that I snap my own creatures occasionally, and I'd rather just do it for free. you can make the argument that Vapor Snag is slightly better than Snap. Like, it is a slightly more powerful card, but I find Snap to be slightly more versatile. And Cloud of Fairies is just so good with Spell Stutter Sprite. Like, the turn 2 Cloud of Fairy into Spell Stutter Sprite with like a snap still is just amazing, because you can go, Cloud of Fairies, they cast something, you Spell Stutter Sprite it, next turn you attack for 2. When they go to do something, you snap your Spell Stutter Sprite, put it back in your hand, and then Sprite it, and it turns snap into counterspell 11 through 14 if you need it. Often, though, it's just the tempo hit, or to negate something like a Vines of the Vastwood or a Rancor, or stop a Mirror Enforcer from beating down on you. There are many effects of Snap. Snap is a very versatile card. And I was pointing at Cloud Fairies the whole time. Alright, as I was saying, Spell Stutter Sprite. Spell Stutter Sprite is the first of our 10 counters. It's really hard for me to say whether or not it's, like, where it fits, like, in the hierarchy of counters. Like, the counter spells in this deck are all very, very good. Spell Stutter Sprite is more limited in what it can counter. It has to counter. By itself, it only gets a 1-mana card. If you have a Cloud of Fairies, it can get a 2-mana card. It starts snowballing. But this format has so many 1 and 2-mana cards that usually it counters what you need it to counter, and leaves behind that 1/1 flying flash body. And every once in a while, you'll just use it as a removal spell to, throw in a 1/1 creature in front of their creature and trade. Ooh. No, excuse me. And it's also important to note that the basic concept, like the makeup of this deck is, like, it predates Delver of Secrets. There was mono blue fairies that used, and Spellstutter Sprite was the, like, all-star fairy of that deck. So he's important to keep in mind. He's like the grandfather in this deck. All right, Counterspell. Well, what can I say about Counterspell? It's probably the third best counterspell in the game. Like, certainly the first best in Pauper. But I mean, like, really, what's better than it is, like, you can argue, like, Force of Will is clearly better than it. Though Force of Will is only really better than it if you're playing in a format where they're doing really, really unfair things. And Mana Drain is strictly better than it, especially now that there's no mana burn, because you can just, counter something and then do something. But since neither of those cards are legal in Pauper, Counterspell is the best counter in Pauper by a good amount. And this art in particular is my personal favorite art, because back when I first started playing Magic, I started playing just as Ice Age was coming out, and my first playset of Counterspells was this art of Counterspell, and it always brings me back to those heady days of being, 14? Then there's Exclude. This is Counterspells 9 and 10. This is the Pauperman's Cryptic Command. I mean, often Cryptic Command, like, the most frequent thing you're doing with Cryptic Command is countering a spell and drawing a card. Most of the time that spell is usually a creature. Like, from my experience playing the UWR control deck, I would say that's about half the time what you're doing with Cryptic Command. And, like, it's certainly not as good as Cryptic Command by any stretch of the imagination, but it's as good as we're going to get in Pauper, certainly. Counter a creature spell, draw a card. It puts you up a card, it prevents them from hitting every creature at the board, and all of that. It does start topping the curve at 3 mana, because really, the Exclude and Una's Grace are the top of the curve, because nothing else are we ever going to pay more than 3 mana for. Una's Grace is, I really would love to have 2 of them in the deck, but I have no idea what to cut. Like, theoretically it could cut a Gush, but I'm pretty sure Gush is nakedly more powerful, and Una's Grace is probably more powerful over a really long game, but games rarely go long enough for Una's Grace to start taking over. But the ability to, when you get too many lands, like Una's Grace kind of lets us play those 19 lands without worrying about drawing more than 5 or 6. because you can just retrace them at the end of your opponent's turn and keep yourself in that control position and keep getting gas to push the game into the to push through that last uh, quarter mile of the game. Now, Ninja of the Deep Hours is probably the single most removed creature in the entire deck. Like, more so than Delver of Secrets, Ninja of the Deep Hours is such a lightning rod. Because, okay, well, first of all, you never pay the 4 mana for him. Almost always you're going to ninjutsu back one of your evasive guys, usually a Cloud of Fairies or a Stutter Sprite. Every once in a while, an unflipped Delver will charge the gates and turn into a ninja. But, that's generally what it's going to be. And then you get to draw that card. And then usually, assuming you got to draw that card, he gets killed. But if he doesn't get killed, the fact that he's a 2/2 Ophidian that, gets you that card while being for 2. I mean, I suppose I should say 2/2 Scroll Thief because he's closer to Scroll Thief. But he can take, unanswered, he will just take over the game with that 2-1 card advantage. Then we have Gush. Gush is one of those. I have just cast it for 5 mana. It's very rarely done. But it's so good to be able to. Sometimes you can use Gush to let you cast something you wouldn't be able to cast because you're using so much mana by tapping 2 islands if you don't have an island in your hand, bouncing them both, playing 1, tapping it, and that gets you that extra 1 mana that you like if you needed 5 mana and had 4 land but only had 4 lands in play, it'll happen occasionally. It's very rare that you actually need to do that. Usually it means you ninjutsu'd back something and you're gonna play something else, and then But it's a very good more often with the mana thing. What I found I needed to do is occasionally I would ninjutsu something back, and then only have 4 lands in play, and then I would bounce the 2 tapped ones, play 1 so I could keep up Exclude. But Gush is incredibly powerful. I mean, drawing 2 cards for 0 mana is amazing. And the fact that sometimes returning those islands is even beneficial if you have Una's Grace. It's a very, very powerful card. And then there's the 3 Spire Golems. Now, the 3 Spire Golems are your big butts in the sky. They can stop up they can stop most aggro decks. I mean, Stompy can always throw a giant growth spell and then just try and power through. But often, they just end up eating guys as they try and keep their aggro train going. And but the real problem with Spire Golem I have is that he still dies to Flame Slash. He still dies to Galvanic Blast versus Affinity and Electrostatic Bolt. He's immune to Lightning Bolt. But the only deck that really seems to genuinely not be able to remove him is often Goblins. Other decks seem to be able to generally spend 1 card and kill him, but they need to have that card, and if you snap him, sometimes that'll just put them completely out of the match. Now, I want to take a quick moment to point out that I mentioned that this is Control Delver and that it's only 10 card difference. Generally, those cards are going to be they're probably only going to play 1 Gush. They're going to cut probably the 2 Quicksands on an island. They're going to cut the Una's Grace and the Excludes. They're going to cut the Brainstorms for Preordains. Maybe a Snap. They might not run Piracy Charm. And they're going to add in... they're going to trade in the Excludes for Dazes, which overall I prefer Excluded Daze, in general, because I don't really like the tempo hit for a Force Spike. But Daze can be very powerful with the right hand. They go up to the 2 Phantasmal. They go up to 4 Phantasmal Bears. They switch in the Brainstorms for Preordains, and then they bring in the Frostburn Weirds, which Frostburn Weird is really strong, and I am tempted actually to pull out the 2 Phantasmal Bears and put in 2 Frostburn Weirds to go even more on a more control plan. because Frostburn Weird can just take over the ground so well against so many decks. But I'm not doing that this week. Now, let's go to the sideboard. Alright. Now, our sideboard, we have, okay, 4 Hydroblasts. Mostly this is going to be against goblins, to some degree like Is It Post, and other decks that use a lot of red removal. And that's generally, we're going to take out Piracy Charm for the Hydroblast, because it's just better to be able to counter one of the removal spells than it is to be able to have your... Like, against goblins, this is both a removal spell and a counter spell. It is just better than Piracy Charm. Against Is It Post, this is a counter spell for their removal spell. Also, it enables you to stop Rolling Thunder, which can be... a lot of them aren't running the Crusher anymore. Even in a long drawn out game, sometimes that Hydroblasting, that, like, if they think you can only counter once and you can counter and Hydroblast, it'll sometimes leave them without a victory condition. Alright, this week I swapped out... This spot used to be 3 boomerangs, but very few people play the decks boomerang was good against anymore. I mean, Familiar Storm and Hexproof were the decks that really, like, boomerang could punish, because, you know, they'd spend a turn enchanting one of their lands or playing a Caro land, and then you would bounce it and set them back 2 turns. But they very rarely, they're just not played anymore. And I've had problems with Affinity, so I'm trying this one out. And I figure, as a 1-mana counter / bounce spell for artifacts, it's good. Like, hopefully this will, like, catch some Mirror Enforcers and counter them, because those are probably what I've lost most of the games to. 2 Deprives. This is against and the Fairy Trickery. Against matchups where you need more counter magic. This is generally going to be the matchups where you're going up against Temporal Fissure. You're going to want to use, like, you need to make sure you're catching the cards that enable them to get towards fissuring. Often you're going to want to catch, with Fairy Trickery, if you can catch the Ghostly Flicker. With that, it's amazing, because then it's just removed from game. That means the Mnemonic Wall won't be able to retrieve it, so that's awesome. Though depriving, the Mnemonic Walls or the Cloud of Fairies, which can be good, will help you. Really, against those, you're just trying to keep them from going off long enough for you to kill them. Like, you are not oddly, you are not the control deck in that matchup as much, but you are playing a very... that matchup's a really weird nature, because you're both the beatdown and the control. So it's one of those, if they don't go off, the longer they don't go off, the more likely they are to die, but you also need to be the one applying pressure. I guess technically you can argue you are the control deck in there, but it seems much more like you're kind of both the clock and the long-term one there. But that's probably why Delver just tends to beat Temporal Fissure. Okay, Curse of Chains. I know some players use Snake Form in this spot, and I don't like Snake Form. The reason I don't like Snake Form is that 12 of our creatures, if you include unflipped Delvers, just die into combat with a 1/1. And, like, the number of times you'll be able to actually catch someone when you have 3 mana untapped, get them into blocking or, striking in. I just felt like more often than not when I would have... Because I played Snake Form several times, and I'd feel like Snake Form was sitting in my hand being a dead card if I wasn't winning. But if I was winning, it would just make me win more. Whereas Curse of Chains feels like if I'm at a board state where it's more like parity, it lets me get ahead. Whereas Snake Form, I feel like I already needed to be ahead for Snake Form to push me further ahead. So I switched it out for Curse of Chains. And for the most part, it does most of what you would want it to do. There's a couple of creatures that Snake Form would answer that Curse of Chains doesn't, but they're very niche. Like, I can't even think of any, actually, because, like, one of the big ones would be the Guardian of the Guild pack, and this is also multicolor, so it gets them. This gets Mirror Enforcers. This gets Carapace Forgers. This is great against the really overpowered stompy guys. Also, Snake Form does not help against creatures that have +1/+1 counters. So, like, Hunger of the Howl Pack can really blow you out. Because if they have a 1/1 that's actually a 4/4, like if they just have a Quirion Ranger that they threw Hunger of the Howl Pack on because you killed a guy, Snake Form doesn't help you. It's still a 4/4. So I like Curse of Chains a little better. Stitch Drake. Stitch Drake he's there for um, a lot of matchups where you just need that extra that big body, like or the extra threat, like against Mono Black, against other Delver decks. Like he's good. He's a good guy. He's a nice big beater. And then Serrated Arrows is against almost all creature decks that have, like, if most of the creatures will die to a 1/1 counter, Serrated Arrows comes in. Also, Serrated Arrows is really good against decks that have a lot of creatures. Like generally, Serrated Arrows and Stitch Drake are going to come in at the same time. And what Serrated Arrows is really good at is whittling a guy down so that your big flyers can then eat him. Like if they have a 3 toughness guy and they swing in, a Serrated Arrows plus a Golem kills it. And it's good. Trust me, they're very good. Even though they're from Homelands and evil memories of Homelands. So that covers the deck tech. Thank you for watching / listening. And I will be playing this in about 20 minutes. So hopefully well, it won't be 20 minutes for you, but hopefully you'll watch the video of at least the first match, hopefully the whole tournament. Thank you.